climate policy is ratcheting up around the world, and one of the options available to policymakers is nature-based solutions, basically using the land to create offset credits. And the Pembina Institute has recently done a report on nature-based solutions. So we're going to talk to Nina Lothian about that. Welcome to the interview, Nina.
Hi, Markham. Thanks.
Well, look, you've written this report. Can you give us an overview of it, please?
Sure. I might actually just take a step back right off the top, because I think we need to be clear when we're talking about nature-based solutions, what we actually mean. And I think we use the shorthand nature-based solutions, but what we really mean is nature-based climate solutions, because there's loads of benefits that nature provides to us that aren't purely climate. And so, for example, there's habitat, there's biodiversity, there's ability to clean water or prevent flooding, that kind of thing. So when we're talking about here, we use the term nature-based solutions, but we're really talking about this more narrow subset of the climate benefits of nature.
Gotcha.
So starting there, I think we all know carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants. It's also stored in our soil, in our peatlands, in our wetlands. And so the idea of nature-based climate solutions is to prevent the release of that carbon dioxide that is, or other GHG emissions that is currently stored within the natural landscape. And it's also about taking actions to increase the absorption potential of our natural landscapes. So planting trees, we're all familiar with that idea of if you can plant a tree, it will absorb carbon dioxide over its life, reducing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But more importantly, I think in Canada is actually the prevention of releases. So this is protection of land, conservation of land, is really the most significant actions that we can take to reduce emissions associated with our natural ecosystem.
Right. Well, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So I understand, I mean, there's a lot of concern in the that I've read about where, folks are worried that the offsets created by this will be used by, emitting industries to be a substitute for actual emissions reductions. They'll think it's seen as the easy way out. And I understand in your paper that you argue for a viable, robust set of protocols and standards and so on. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, for sure. I might want to just take a step back, because we're jumping into the concept of a carbon offset, and that is not the only tool in our toolbox to kind of create these nature-based solutions. So offsets is one tool we have, and it's sort of a market mechanism to create the incentives for people to take action to increase the carbon absorption potential of their land, or to prevent the release of GHG emissions. But carbon offsets, anyway, maybe I'll step back. So carbon offsets, you can have a compliance market for carbon offsets. So you can trade offsets if you're under a regulatory scheme, and it's one of the tools you have to meet your compliance obligations. There's also a voluntary carbon offset market where companies like Google and Microsoft might want to commit to reducing their carbon footprint, and they're buying offsets, but it's just a voluntary action, and there's voluntary projects that are selling into that voluntary market. So there's two mechanisms. But carbon offsets do have a credibility issue, particularly around the nature-based solutions one. And I think we've heard stories of companies buying carbon offsets because they've reforested something, and then that forest burnt down, or that forest was impacted by an infestation. And so the actual carbon benefits that were purchased have gone up in smoke in the case of a fire, or essentially just disappeared. And so there's been issues around the actual legitimacy of nature-based carbon offsets, which is an absolutely valid concern. So in order to make carbon offsets credible, you'll see in our report, we've got a list of sort of criteria of basic conditions that need to be addressed in order to make sure that if I'm either selling a carbon offset or I'm buying a carbon offset, it's legitimate. And so those are things like permanence. So the example I just gave of a forest going up in smoke, I can't sell a carbon offset if I haven't addressed the permanence of it. There's also leakage. So for example, if I'm buying a carbon offset in one jurisdiction, but it just means that activity is moving over to the other jurisdiction, the atmosphere is not better off. Leakage, additionality, making sure that these actions aren't things that are going to happen of their own accord, and that I'm actually paying for something that increases the change. So those are some of the criteria. Now you asked, sorry, I'll let
Well,
you
look,
speak.
I have a question about who sets the standards, because in Canada, the Constitution provides resource management. That jurisdiction belongs to the provinces. So are we looking at the provinces having to do this, or is this a job for the federal government?
It's a combination of both. So Alberta actually has a fairly active carbon offset system. And when I'm talking about carbon offsets, it means more than just nature-based solution carbon offsets. There's things like methane reduction, managing, landfill emissions, things like that. So Alberta has a series of what we call offset protocols, which outline that sort of permanence, additionality, leakage, and sort of the quantification. How do you measure and verify that those emissions are actually real? And I think they have about 20 protocols in play right now, none of which are actually around nature or sort of this natural offset. There was an agricultural one that's been removed because it was proven to no longer be additional. So that's a provincial jurisdiction. I know BC is working on offset protocols, Ontario is as well, but the federal government is also developing protocols that can be in place in the case of a province not having a protocol. And so the federal government has a program in development. I think there's ability to comment on it right now. And I think they have 4 protocols that they're proposing initially, one of which is around forest management.
Right. Are you optimistic, based on the work that's going on at the federal and provincial level, that Canada will come up with credible offsets and nature-based solutions program?
I think that's a good question. And I think it requires engagement and stakeholder involvement. I think we can. I guess Pembina believes we can have credible protocols, but we need to do the due diligence. We need to ensure the science is complete, and that will require engagement, discussion, and landing on protocols that are credible. So I think it's possible, but it requires effort. And yeah.
Great, Nina. Oh, sorry. Well, look, thank you very much for your insights here. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, I was just sorry. The one question you did ask me that I didn't answer was around where do offsets fit in terms of sort of a hierarchy of mitigation or adaptation. And I think that's one thing Pembina feels really strongly about, is that direct emission reductions are the most important step we must take. So offsets are sort of they're a good short-term action as we develop the technologies to really do the harder decarbonization. They're useful in those hard to abate sectors. But beyond 2050, we can't afford offsets. We need to be at zero emissions or net zero emissions. And beyond 2050, there is significant role for carbon removal to remove the GHG emissions in the atmosphere. Technology such as carbon capture and storage plays a role, but nature also plays a role in that carbon removal phase post 2050.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Nina. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome, Markham. Thanks for the opportunity.